The size of the brain and human intelligence are interconnected.
There are no direct correlations, merge.
Is that good or bad?
Well, ideally, we should have invited several women here who have experience with breastfeeding and organized a discussion between them.
The lie detector is working.
Of course.
Sour, bitter, sweet, salty.
The life hack is that you really need to eat a little bit of everything.
As a scientist, what is your specific attitude toward pornography?
When everything starts, you don't even know what it's going to turn into.
Friends, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Dubynin, Doctor of Biological Sciences. You are just a smart person in general.
Good afternoon.
I read your book about the brain and selected questions by chapters that if I ask them and you give honest answers, I think my audience will be very grateful and it will be very useful for them. Let's go through these chapters directly and try to focus on the most interesting things. I have the most questions about the chapter brain and food.
Well, it's just that you didn't get past the first chapter. A good student reads the first and part of the last chapter, then just goes with the flow, right? Usually the professor just remembers the first chapter too.
But that one was the most interesting to me, because I have a special attitude toward food. Our subscribers are interested in why we are so drawn to food and why it's so hard to stick to a diet.
Well, actually, food is a very reliable source of positive emotions. In fact, it's the most reliable one. Yes, you can go to the theater and not like the play. You can have an argument with a friend, but a good piece of food at the right time will never let you down. That's why actually food, which is traditionally seen as a source of energy, a source of essential nutrients, also serves this third extremely important function, to make us happy. And then, of course, life itself, which is full of stress, depression, failures, and so on. This is where food starts to play this role in a rather tricky way. The problem is also that evolution didn't create any kind of calorie limiter inside us, meaning that clearly when our biological species was developing, there was always a shortage of food. You had to chase after something, catch it, or at least dig up some roots. That's why, in fact, our brain and those ancient structures responsible for biological needs operate on the assumption that if there's food, you need to consume it. And the only limitation is when your stomach is full. So when nothing else works and it's already 3, 4, or 5 liters up to the point of pain, that's why people overeat, and then a whole bunch of problems start related to weight gain and some more specific issues like diabetes. Well, it depends on which way the metabolism is skewed, because ideally you should eat a little bit of everything and have a varied diet, but in our conditions with such a big food industry making food for us, that's not easy. And here really everyone has to be a bit of an expert, or maybe not just a bit.
The chapter discusses competing needs. That is, we have different needs and sometimes they don't go together and each one in fact pulls a little in its own direction. That is, you can't want both sex and food at the same time. These are different needs. There, the golden cage principle was explained. You're missing something. Let's say freedom is one of the needs, but at the same time you have a lot of food, for example, or other kinds of benefits. So, tell me, what does it depend on that some people really want freedom while others can easily say goodbye to their freedom in exchange for having good internet, a good salary, good food, and so on?
They feed you well, right? Well, actually, when it comes to some simple basic biological needs, this question has already been studied quite well. That is, you can track the activity of the centers responsible for sexual behavior, eating behavior, centers of fear, aggression, for example, by analyzing hormone concentrations and centers. In fact, the brain neural networks that handle these tasks are also quite well studied. Well, of course, you can't just stick electrodes into a person, but there is a technique called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which actually allows you to see these neural networks light up and become activated. But for example, programs of empathy, or for instance, programs of freedom, or programs of laziness, energy saving, these are much more common programs. That is, they are not focused on specific individual neural networks. Somewhere there in the anterior hypothalamus, or in the middle part of the amygdala, but rather, they are a global property of many different neural networks, and studying them is much more difficult. Nevertheless, the desire for freedom can probably be rephrased as the desire to overcome obstacles. So it's a broader story, you could say. This is truly embedded in our very nature. It's no coincidence that Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, in 1917, between the February and October revolutions, wrote The Reflex of Freedom, highlighting its importance for any developed brain, and just how much a particular person has this love of freedom established. We actually still understand very little about it at the level of physiological processes. We recognize these as global neural network properties, but it's not possible to say they're caused by just 5 genes and 2 hormones. By the way, it's easier when it comes to food, because we analyze leptins, orexins, ghrelins, molecules that specifically work with the food centers. This is why psychologists and educators' perspectives on a person's behavior and situational testing are so important. If you want to know, for example, how freedom-loving your employee or your spouse is, you need to conduct these tests in one way or another, either openly or discreetly. And each of us doesn't always know this about ourselves either. Because when you live in conditions where certain types of activity are more or less permitted, widely allowed, then let's say your company, your team, or your society doesn't really put much pressure on you. But when those very walls start closing in, that's when someone says, no, that's it. I can't work under these conditions. Well, for example, many people can't work in certain state corporations where, as a rule, there are all these instructions. They're stricter, more precise, and have a very rigid hierarchy. It's no coincidence these so-called teal organizations were invented. Come to us, here you'll find much more freedom and self-expression, because people who have a high degree of freedom are often, not always, but often more creative. They don't have mental limitations. Of course, getting them involved in some business processes is great. Take someone who is deeply autistic, but a brilliant programmer, create all the right conditions for him, and he'll come up with something amazing for you. You are in...
In your book, you write that 50% is genetics, 25% is prenatal, and 25% is postnatal. Well, let's say that's how your programming works. And that's why a mother who is constantly undernourished and a child who grows up hungry can end up being someone who is always hungry and overeats.
Yes, that's correct. Many studies already exist on this topic, beginning with simple statistical research. And such classic studies include the analysis of how children born during World War I in Europe feel. Well, somewhere there. In Belgium, in the Netherlands, back in the times when World War I was ending and the Second Front was about to open, it was very hungry. And women, nevertheless, were pregnant. And then it turned out that their offspring gained weight very seriously. Well, that's basically how it all started. And we understand that along with the fact that there are genes, which are often perceived as a system that works on an all-or-nothing principle. There is also epigenetics, which is an additional adjustment of these genes depending, for example, on stress during pregnancy. Then your gene may function at 90%, 80%, or even 70% instead of 100%. These epigenetic adjustments are now being studied seriously. There is either DNA methylation or acetylation of the so-called histones, that is, proteins that help DNA configure itself in the nucleus. And, most importantly, these settings, which seem to be non-genetic, can often be passed on to the next generation through germ cells. So not only the daughter, but also the granddaughter, and maybe even the great-granddaughter, will have a somewhat shifted spectrum of gene activity.
That is, it can be said with confidence that a pregnant woman starving herself just to avoid gaining weight, which, by the way, is something many do just to avoid gaining weight. This is not very good because it harms the offspring.
Yes, in general, a pregnant woman should be treated gently. Less stress and inflammation are best. Because, well, the process of setting and installing genes is very fragile, as is the kinetic information, is unpacked and turns into an organism, and in particular into neural networks.
You mentioned the stomach, that when we feel hungry, one of the reasons is an empty stomach. And that's why when we're hungry, by drinking a large amount of water, we can basically suppress it for a while. And that's also why stomach resection surgery helps. The body doesn't detect calorie count, but recognizes the amount. How does this brain principle function?
Well, actually, there are nerve fibers in the walls of the stomach that simply transmit information about how stretched it is to the hypothalamus, to the hunger center. Well, naturally, it's primarily the vagus nerve, which actually deals with our internal organs, that is the 10th cranial nerve. But in addition, it turned out that there is a parallel mechanism. There are special neuroendocrine cells in the walls of the stomach that secrete ghrelin, which is a hormone-like peptide. Peptides are fragments of proteins, and ghrelin also reaches the hypothalamus at the endocrine level. To be clear, when your stomach is empty, you need to eat.
I also have some questions about it. It turns out that an empty stomach is deaf to learning because the thirst for knowledge is also one of the basic needs, that is, to receive information. And it turns out that if we are hungry, there may be competition. One need interferes with another need, and that's why you should study without feeling hungry.
Well, it would be better, yes, to study while feeling just a little bit full, but it's important not to overeat, because as soon as you do, blood flow is redistributed and your mental processes are left without enough oxygen. Because basically, as soon as food seriously starts passing through the walls of the gastrointestinal tract into the blood vessels expand, and carbohydrates work this way very strongly. Lipids do too, meaning there's an instant expansion. And in fact, the blood really flows to the stomach and intestines. From where? From the head, from the brain. That's why you need to maintain this optimal level of slight fullness or slight hunger.
I read that some children are born without a developed sense of hunger, and if, let's say, you don't give him food, relying on the fact that he has this sucking reflex, he won't cry. Many children are very calm at birth because they don't cry due to a lack of hunger. And on the contrary, this actually becomes a worrying sign for the mother that the baby doesn't ask for the breast and is calm. What should you do in such situations to make sure the baby doesn't go hungry?
Well, actually, when the baby is born, we constantly monitor them, and in particular, we weigh them all the time. And this is exactly what's important. Timely weight gain is very important. Formula feeding is generally straightforward. That is, you can see exactly how many milliliters of formula the baby has consumed. And it's the same story with breastfeeding. You just weigh and weigh. Typically, this lack of hunger is seen in premature babies, especially those born very early. If everything is normal, then the baby will signal to you. So pediatricians, child psychologists, and of course parents distinguish several types of baby crying. I'm hungry, wet diapers, I'm bored, come entertain me, just temperature, discomfort. So that's basically it. Right now, artificial intelligences are being connected to this process. That is, a neural network can easily learn to detect the types of your baby's crying. Turns out there are about a dozen of them.
Leptin is what prevents us from gaining excess weight. And there are often people who have insulin resistance combined with leptin resistance. Some people say that it's basically conditional. You can just put an equal sign right away. I read in your book that because of the structural features of leptin, it passes very poorly through the blood-brain barrier. Yes, and there is such a feature that the older we get, the worse it passes into the brain. That's why, in principle, even if your testosterone levels are good at 20, 30, and 50, the situation remains the same. It turns out that simply because of age-related changes, because leptin decreases, we basically tend to gain weight as we get older for this reason as well.
Well, yes, you could say that you want to eat more. That is, when the leptin signal is insufficient, the hunger center becomes overly active. And this is one of those age-related problems. It's not always the case, but it happens quite often. In general, the blood-brain barrier is a very special area of physiology that is now being studied very actively. It has always been studied actively, but right now it's being studied especially actively in terms of neuroinflammation. Because in principle, yes, large molecules and especially cells should not pass through the blood-brain barrier. And as a rule, if something does get through, it doesn't pass between the cells, but rather through special transport systems. That is, proteins that carry all this from the bloodstream first into the epithelial cells and then release it into the nervous tissue. So all of this is in general a very separate story, again genetically programmed. But naturally, when there are some problems, and in particular total inflammation in the body, or for example some kind of chronic severe stress, then that blood-brain barrier starts to get distorted, and some substances pass through better while others pass through worse. And with leptin, the story usually goes in the direction of worse. So
when we start to experience more stress, we begin to crave food more, and most likely we crave something unhealthy as well. Well, yeah.
Actually, it's not just about leptin. There are many factors that come together. So the leptin system is very gentle and careful. It doesn't act like some kind of dictator. But nevertheless, it's very important, and not just for the appetite center. For example, it's very important for women to have normal ovulation. That is, if a woman's body is too thin and there's not enough leptin, amenorrhea can occur. Simply because the centers in the hypothalamus that produce various luliberins say, no, you're too thin to carry a child. We stop ovulation, go eat something first.
We often see this in female athletes who tie themselves out with diets. And what about ghrelin? What is its role? How does it actually work in our body?
Well, actually, again, it reaches through the blood-brain barrier. It's a smaller molecule, so it's easier for it to penetrate. After all, leptin is a huge protein, while ghrelin is several times shorter and reaches the hypothalamic hunger centers, which are mainly the lateral side and central areas of the hypothalamus. And there are receptors for ghrelin right there. And along with other factors like blood glucose levels and insulin concentration, ghrelin makes a significant contribution to appetite levels. That's why they're working with it now. It seems that it's the most accessible in terms of, for example, reducing the activity of the system. Yes, so much so that there's even discussion about a kind of mild vaccination against ghrelin, so that antibodies would catch it in the bloodstream and this hunger signal wouldn't be transmitted so intensely. Well, scientists are always proposing some projects, and on the one hand, there's a strong desire to explore some area and get some results that will be put into practice. We mainly want to do research because we're curious, but we need grants and funding to continue. And so a scientific article comes out, like a gene has been discovered that, is now going to save the world. Naturally, this is almost always quite an exaggeration and a kind of marketing move, but still ghrelin looks very promising. But actually, just a few days ago, I listened to a big updated lecture on gastrointestinal hormones. We have Professor Vyacheslav Smirnov at our department. She gives excellent overview lectures. She's really a super guru in this field. This is the so-called amine precursor uptake and decarboxylation system. I think so, yes. And there are actually 50 hormones there, shuffling their activity so that everything works properly. And originally, this is actually aimed not even at the brain, but at the normal functioning of the intestines. Because there are 10 meters of tubes that need to send signals to each other on time. So here, it means that the food is already digested to a certain extent. We activate peristalsis, change absorption, change the tone of the blood vessels, and send some additional signals to the liver and pancreas. Well, not to mention the brain. So it's a very fascinating system. Well, not to mention that there are almost as many neurons in the walls of the intestines as there are in the spinal cord. And it's kind of a giant neural network that apparently both learns and even sometimes gives us dreams. So this abdominal brain is incredibly interesting.
Well, I'm really glad you brought this up because there are people without specialized education, and when they say, for example, that the intestines are immunity or that the intestines are also about mood, most people just think they're crazy. Actually, there really is this gut system. And for example, I liked that melatonin is produced in the intestines. Yes, we're all used to associating melatonin with sleep. It turns out melatonin has a different local effect. It actually synchronizes various parts of the intestine. In other words, how does the body know that food is coming in, that something needs to be secreted somewhere, that something will soon arrive from above, and how it... And I found it so interesting that, by the way, I actually made an episode on this topic, but I probably won't publish it because I felt that I didn't study this topic deeply enough or know it well enough, and I think other people should talk about this topic. I was really interested, especially since you mentioned they work locally, but with certain gut problems, they start to enter the bloodstream, some of them, and can really cause certain negative consequences.
On top of that, there are also problems with the microbiota, which is a whole separate world. And in the end, at first, it's about the interaction between the gut and the microbiota, and then about the interaction between the gut and the rest of the body. And if some kind of inflammation is added to this, or God forbid, celiac disease, which is already an autoimmune condition, then things get really, really complicated. That's why there's a huge interest in the gut, especially in those areas where we're dealing with some pharmacoresistant forms of diseases. About 80% of epilepsy cases follow standard protocols, but 20% do not. Similarly, 70% of depression cases are managed, while 30% are not, and that's when it's unmanaged. That's when manipulations and certain interventions on the same microbiota, not always, but sometimes turn out to be very beneficial. In the same way, some additional influence on the endocrine system, working with pro-inflammatory hormones.
Since we've started discussing the gut, I have 2 quick questions about it. Does the keto diet really reduce the risk of epileptic seizures?
Let's put it this way. It's something you can try if it's a pharmacoresistant case. In that case, reducing excess carbohydrates sometimes changes the state of the whole system so much that it works. But there isn't really a direct connection or a straightforward mechanism. It's more about working with the overall level of inflammation, because actually the current mainstream in brain research is neuroinflammation. Of course, the COVID pandemic also triggered this, but we can see how inflammation, even if it's rather mild but prolonged, this sluggish, ongoing inflammation basically changes the balance of excitation and inhibition in neural networks. And there you go. Epilepsy, autism spectrum disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder become more likely. Or things like depression, anxiety, panic attacks. So actually, neuroinflammation is a really important thing. And what are the mechanisms there? Something goes wrong somewhere. Well, I don't know. There could really be food allergies or, say, arthritis in a person or the prostate. Many things can be chronically inflamed. Then a certain cytokine environment develops with all sorts of interleukins and tumor necrosis factors. All of this passes through the blood-brain barrier, reaching primarily the glial cells, the supporting cells of the nervous system, and then through changes in their response, it affects the neural networks. And what changes is more likely the overall level of anxiety activation. So it's not about some mental stories, not about remembering something or having memory blocks or panic attacks and so on. Rather, it's this emotional tonic background that fluctuates. And then it turns out to be a game. And with keto diets, or for example, gluten-free diets, casein-free diets, this doesn't always work. Well, not to mention that keto diets are far from suitable for everybody. There's a real imbalance there. After all, cutting out carbohydrates completely causes our bodies to be deeply confused. But why not give it a try?
Question. Tastes. Sour, bitter, sweet, salty. These are the flavors we've been used to considering tasty for many hundreds of years. 2 more have appeared, the protein taste and the fatty taste.
It's called oleogustus?
Yes. Tell me, why do we even need taste sensations from food? Because, for example, I can't eat the same thing every day. When I feed my dog, she always rushes over and eats like it's her first time, enjoying it immensely. Humans don't have that. Why do we need different tastes in food? Well,
if you compare it to a dog, and the dog is still a predator to some extent, then in general, predators compared to omnivores, and especially herbivores, don't have a very developed taste system, because in nature they mainly eat meat. Food is food, meat is protein, so that's fine. And if you're herbivores, you usually eat a lot of different kinds of plants. And first, you need to distinguish the toxic options, or still prefer those options with more carbohydrates, or maybe more fat, or more protein. And so the taste system is more developed in herbivores, or in omnivores like us. And actually, these 4 basic tastes have been known since the time of Hippocrates. And, well, yeah, that's how it is. We got a bit carried away and oversimplified, because even within bitter, there are 43 subtypes. But then, yes, protein, fat, here's the thing. Our taste system is a chemical laboratory that's located in the oral cavity. Our ancestors often lacked food, so it was vital to know you were eating something valuable. Fats, proteins, and carbohydrates are the three macronutrients in food that supply energy and building blocks. Carbohydrates are the sweet stuff, along with fats and proteins. Obviously, these receptors must exist, but their discovery was somehow delayed. And then actually glutamate receptors, protein receptors, they were discovered in the early 20th century, over 100 years ago. And
I wanted to ask about him too.
yeah, so yes, wonderful. That Japanese guy, Kinekita, discovered, patented, and quickly used them as flavor enhancers. But with Oleogustus, that is the taste of fat, things got a bit delayed, even for humans. They have been described, well, in general, you could say less than 10 years ago. But since then, we've made so much progress, and now it's clear how it works. It works much like the glutamate taste by using the metabotropic receptor system. And these three main tastes, in terms of the usefulness of food, fatty, carbohydrate, and accordingly protein, are connected by an innate mechanism to the centers of positive emotions. And we like this food, that's just how it is. That's why the taste of fat matters, it exists, and there is a reaction to fatty acids. Actually, V.
McDonald's, as I know, in quite large quantities. For example, yes, glutamate was added, and for us it comes in waves as usual. Any information, like in the world, first all the harm is in carbohydrates, then all the harm is in fats. Now there's something a bit new. Well,
White death, another one, yeah.
and they used to call glutamate the white death. Later, when it was found out, they started saying it's absolutely safe. In your book, I read that, first of all, it turns out that his is actually different. The glutamate that we eat as additives, or the one that exists in our central nervous system, it also passes through poorly.
But
If there's a lot of it, then it turns out, and this was a discovery for me, that it can cause. Well, if you have hypertension, you can overstimulate your central nervous system and you'll have a hypertensive crisis. So if you have hypertension, basically fast food is, to put it mildly, not recommended for you for medical reasons.
that's a good, healthy lifestyle idea. If you have hypertension, always watch your diet. Well, actually, in principle, with a single fast food meal, it's unlikely that you'll consume 10 grams of glutamate. But if you start doing this chronically, like every other day, and especially every day, or even twice a day, and sometimes people really get hooked on this food, then there's nothing good about it. So
What else stimulates us? For example, people with hypertension should avoid stimulating their central nervous system. So, are there any other foods or substances that you would recommend avoiding to keep the mind calm? Well,
actually everyone knows about limiting table salt, because here's what happens in this case. Here's a person. We all have different taste preferences, and the same goes for sour, salty, and spices. Yes, we like them differently, even at an innate level. Then what's called the cuisine of your childhood joins in very seriously. Because, for example, Mexican cuisine, or I don't know, Georgian cuisine, or Slavic, like Russian cuisine, they're very different stories, not to mention Japanese or, say, Ethiopian cuisine. Right, but yours again. This very hypothalamus forms food preferences, literally, in the first years of life, largely based on this initial childhood pattern, the pattern of these very nutrients. There you go. That's what you build on. And for example, in your childhood kitchen, it was quite common to use a lot of salt, to oversalt things. By the way, that's actually typical for coastal regions historically, because people who lived along the shores of seas and oceans were mostly engaged in fishing. How do you store fish? We salt it, especially with the sea's abundance of salt, boiling it down, and that's how hypertension develops. Well, if you look at the literature, for example, from the 1960s and 1970s, it was all definitely along the ocean shores. Same with Japan, right? Most people there had hypertension. Because with their seafood-based cuisine back then, people were eating almost 40 grams of salt. So if you grew up loving salt and keep consuming it like that, and since sodium chloride also gives us positive emotions, there's a high chance that by constantly oversalting your food, you'll end up with hypertension. And then, as someone with hypertension, you'll have to painfully restrict sodium chloride, but you've already gotten so used to it, haven't you? Someone without this predisposition or hypertension might hear the advice to eat no more than 10 grams of salt, or ideally 5 grams per day. They're confused. I don't eat much anyway. Unfortunately, this is a feedback system. Your original eating habits lead to diseases, and then in order to get out of these diseases, you have to give up those eating habits, and that's hard. But
these eating habits that we instill in children at a very young age, they last a lifetime and you can't get rid of them anymore. That is, they will always love spicy food, for example. Well,
early childhood memories like that, yes, you'll still want it. And this doesn't just apply to food. It's like, well, I don't know. Did you grow up by the sea or in the mountains, right? In a small village or a big city, did they take you places? Since childhood, you never visited museums. It all makes sense. Childhood memories are crucial later on.
And time is that very critical programming when it comes to us.
It is believed that in the first 4 years.
Also with food.
Yes, also with food. So basically when a baby is born, all the neurons are more or less already in their places. And then during the first 2 or 3 years, the neural network is formed, branches grow, and synapses appear. And in the 3rd year, the 4th year, this initial very dense network starts to get loaded with information. And many such settings, they happen exactly at this preschool age. And not even quite a preschooler yet, but just a little earlier. Here,
Xenia is sitting behind you. She can't eat onions, she can't stand them, she can't even watch someone eat onions, although I, for example, really love onions. Yes, it happens. It's been that way since childhood, right? Well, how justified is it to say that such a dislike specifically for onions might be related to poisoning? During this sensitive childhood period,
it could have been anything, not necessarily poisoning, but it could have just happened that, say, someone was frying onions, and at that moment you happen to have some kind of infection or something else. Because our brain works on the principle of association, it's pretty straightforward. If the events coincided, then after that they are perceived as a kind of informational unity. And for example, if you started having some kind of cold, or even got food poisoning from something else while smelling fried onions, this would be the starting point.
A black cat crossing your path happened the same way in daily life.
Well, the black cat is a somewhat simpler story, but basically, yes. So this association, just by coincidence in time, yes, coincidence in time, is characteristic of our brain. How else can we analyze the world? Yes, you walk out of your building, a black cat runs by, and then, you trip and fall into a puddle. Maybe the cat is to blame, but that's another issue. The cat story is actually more nuanced, because it often comes down to trying to create some kind of coherent picture of the world. In this coherent worldview, explaining everything is highly desirable. Yes, so if some part of our life doesn't have an explanation, like a gray spot, it irritates us, it's uncertainty, it's a potential danger. That's where superstition comes from, and to a large extent, that's where religions come from as well, which serve many functions, but among them is also to provide explanations. Science also advances mainly due to this. Someone needs to explain to me why the sun rises every day and how it gets there. Yes, it's born there every time. Maybe it travels through an underground tunnel, as the Egyptians believed sails on a boat, or the earth is round. Are you crazy? Everything would fall off.
Why is there a restriction on food? Well, there are people who are forced to do it all the time. For example, a girl who works as a model or a ballerina, and she has to be very slim, constantly restricting herself a lot. People in these professions often become addicted to drugs, fall into depression, or turn to alcohol. Why can these strict long-term food restrictions cause depression? Well,
basically, since food is the most important source of positive emotions, and when you cut off this source with a strict diet, your brain starts to shift toward negative experiences. And how are you going to cope with them? You can move, yes, you can learn new things, or you can end up developing pharmacological dependencies.
Or maybe you can recommend some supplements, like if you're on a diet, maybe take tryptophan, maybe take some gamma-aminobutyric acid. Any life hacks?
Well, actually, the life hack is that you really need to eat a little bit of everything. That's it. Well, I usually say it like this. Let's say you really love oatmeal and it's your favorite porridge. But that doesn't mean you have to eat oatmeal every morning. Because no matter how wonderful a dish is, whether it's a grain, a vegetable, or a fruit, it still doesn't have the full set of vitamins and micronutrients. Basically, there won't be any essential components no matter what. That's why it's important, yes, to have this very variety in food. And you just said yourself that you can't eat the same thing all the time. You have this program and it works well for you subconsciously. And for some people, food caution is more typical, like, no, in the morning I only eat oatmeal, that's it. And that's not good. What's the problem? Really, our taste system was originally built as we analyze macronutrients in food by taste, but not micronutrients. That's it. That is how much vitamin B2 or B6 or I don't know, vitamin E or zinc or iron is in there. We don't know. But the point is, when we were, those aborigines of the African savannah, we ate a little bit of everything. Because, well, as you walk through the savannah, sometimes it's a root, sometimes a leaf, sometimes a fruit, sometimes a bird's egg.
Omnivorous, yes.
Pulled off a lizard's tail. A recent film showed Australian aborigines living this way. He walks along the seashore, eating whatever he finds. And obviously, with such a diet, you get vitamins and micronutrients almost automatically, because you eat a wide variety of things. But the calorie content was often a problem. But now the world has turned upside down and big industry offers us synthetic products which are often just mixed together, like say soy protein, hydrolyzed starch, and well, let's say glutamate, sodium chloride, and some kind of coloring. And then this is pushed through something like a meat grinder, producing fibers that already look like meat fibers. You can make a cutlet, chicken breast, or anything you want. So the large food industry creates excellent imitations. And then looking at the price tag, you find that the same yogurt, for example, a jar can cost, say, 20 rubles, or maybe 40 or even 80. So as a rule, yes, this price ideally should indicate how close the product is to being natural and complete. This applies to everything, including the addition of various pro- and prebiotics, dietary fibers, and even all sorts of colorings and flavorings. Because as people from the food industry say, you can make a strawberry yogurt and it will cost 20 rubles. But then the strawberry scent will be imitated with just 2 or 3 substances, or you can imitate it with 20 substances and that will be much more natural. Then your jar will cost 40 rubles, or you can add real strawberries and some flavorings just in case. 80. So basically the price tag reflects the quality of your food. Next, let's talk about dietary supplements. Do you primarily look at them as a way to make up for nutritional deficiencies? In dietetics, the most important thing is the essential nutrients. And it's not just vitamins and micronutrients. It's actually half of our amino acids. It's unsaturated fatty acids. Basically the things that are primarily associated with plant-based fats. This needs to be understood. This needs to be realized. Our body immediately sends some signals if something is lacking. As a rule, the skin starts to flake or something is wrong with the hair. That is, in general, the first signals come from those organs and tissues that contain constantly dividing cells. This also applies to the reproductive system, but it's not easy to know your sperm cell count. But things like cracks in the corners of your lips, peeling skin, or some sores, those are noticeable. Women often get very concerned when their hair has problems, such as hair loss, which is considered completely unacceptable. That's when we start looking for answers.
Smoking. Why is it that when a person quits smoking, they start gaining weight?
Well, basically, people smoke primarily because of nicotine. Nicotine is similar to one of our neurotransmitters called acetylcholine. Neurotransmitters are molecules that transmit signals between nerve cells. So, acetylcholine itself is extremely important for the functioning of all our muscles. In other words, any muscle contraction we have is triggered by acetylcholine. It's also very important for the functioning of internal organs. But in addition, it's also present in the brain, and it kind of helps to normalize our state. That is, when we're stressed, it calms us down, and when we're sluggish, it energizes us. And nicotine, which comes from smoking, actually imitates these effects of acetylcholine. And one of the effects is the suppression of hunger centers, a moderate suppression of hunger centers. And a person who quits smoking, their overall hunger-satiety balance shifts. And this usually results in a weight gain of 3 to 5 kilograms. You need to be prepared for this. But it's worth it because smoking is a real risk. It's even worse than gaining weight.
I came across an interesting comparison in a book. Snails and children learn to eat in about the same way. They both put everything in their mouths, study it, and only then figure out whether they should eat it or not. A child is born not knowing what is edible and what isn't. So it turns out they determine this by using their taste buds.
Yes, the initial food analysis just considers factors like fat, sweetness, and protein content. That's mother's milk, breast milk. It contains sweet lactose, caseins, and various albumins, which are proteins and a decent amount of fat. Besides that, of course, the most important component of breast milk is calcium, which is necessary for building the skeleton. Well, that's absolutely right. There are also small but important components, antibodies that protect the gastrointestinal tract from harmful infections. That's why, by the way, yes, if a mother breastfeeds her child for at least 8 months, according to large statistics, it additionally provides...
They also have something to say on this matter.
5 intelligence quotient points.
Yes, this is really, really important. Chapter 2, Curiosity. Why does a person need curiosity? Maybe on the one hand it's actually harmful. He climbed up somewhere, forgot where he was going, stuck his nose somewhere and got eaten. So why is it needed?
Well, actually, it's not just people who need it. As neurobiologists, we view this evolutionarily and see that all complex nervous systems are curious. That is, it is aimed at gathering new information and learning, and at better adapting to the surrounding world thanks to this information. The more you know about the world, the more accurately your behavior matches various stimuli and situations. That's why we explore with varying curiosity, looking, approaching, and touching new things. For humans, this becomes the highest level. Curiosity is to name everything with words and the desire to truly describe the surrounding reality as a whole. Just like with food, we see a foundation of positive emotions beneath it. That is, when we eat, we experience pleasant, positive emotions. Amid these emotions, we learn to get food, or at least eat the right food. And there, endorphins play a very important role as a factor of positive emotions. And in the case of novelty, dopamine plays a very important function as well as a molecule that mediates these signals about novelty.
Social networks exploit our reflexes.
Of course, social networks, advertising, propaganda, in other words, all those situations where someone is trying to push extra information onto us. They use all these mechanisms, starting with the orienting reflex, and then, for example, some advertising banner lights up or pops up, and a loud voice tells you, go there, there's a sale, or something like that. And it goes all the way to subtle approaches when they explain to you, through your worldview, that you need to eat healthy food. You need to take supplements because they have antioxidants or something like that. Of course, are all these levels used?
The Coolidge effect, when we have something new. This effect is sometimes used to explain why men get involved with other females. Yes, and that's why sex with a regular partner is different from sex with a new partner. This is also the Coolidge effect, and it appears in our travels. Yes,
Well, still, the Coolidge effect is usually about sexual behavior.
About sexual behavior, but it's about novelty. Last year, I went to the same place where I vacationed the year before, and I thought I liked it so much there. Yeah, it was the best vacation. And I thought, why experiment? I'll go to the same place. And I even took a couple of friends with me. We arrived and everything looked the same and just as cool, but the emotions were different. How?
With the food? Look, your brain is so focused on novelty. Novelty in general, it builds on top of any program. Yeah, new food, a new sexual partner, a new job, and so on. So we have programs that are able to... It adds a second layer to the simpler ones. The same applies to aggression. If things don't work out, it can also increase your eating habits. Someone took my food or someone looked at my partner, bam, there's jealousy. Someone invaded my territory. In this sense, our individual biological needs are food, curiosity, reproduction, and leadership. There's also, safety. On one hand, they are special informational entities in our brain, but they are able to gather together like in flocks, and when they form a certain group, the chance that they will influence our behavior becomes greater. So yes, that's the Coolidge effect. Well, I also don't like going back to the same place too often, but if it's once every 3 years, that's fine, then...
The first question is why travel agents then? In your book, I think you mentioned the travel agent syndrome. These are the people always traveling and seeking novelty, yet sometimes say, can I just stay here? I don't want to go anywhere or do anything. Yes, it seems everything new is better and more interesting to you. So why do they stop wanting something new then?
Well, apparently travel agents also have their own threshold of saturation, because this newness, yes, at some level, well, let's say the Red Sea, the Black Sea, and the White Sea will be different for you. But if you've already visited all sorts of seas 50 times, then for you, in the end, it just becomes another sea. Like, I've already been to the sea 5 times this month. So actually, the thing is, curiosity programs also compete with programs for conserving energy, laziness, and safety. And so, a person who sees that a new trip will give him too little novelty, yes, this dopamine, he says, no, it's better if I just stay comfortably at home and, I don't know, spend my vacation in Moscow as a tourist. That's a great business plan, right? So it's like I'm in Moscow, but not a local. I'm just walking around museums, theaters, and exhibitions. By the way, it's a great way to feel positive. But you need to meditate on this separately, you need to set work aside, and suddenly you realize that you live in a pretty nice place.
Cheating, curiosity, is there any connection between them?
Well, cheating is again a rather complex event. Curiosity might be present there, but there's also status, and in the end, just libido, sexual behavior. The point is that in every person's brain, both polygamous and monogamous programs are installed. I've mentioned this often, that's a question too.
There are questions on this topic, yes.
That polygamous programs are more evolutionarily successful. And they are actually about the fact that reproduction is generally for gene exchange, meaning the original programs of reproduction. They are not about pleasure from sex at all, but about the fact that an offspring should appear with properties different from those of the parents. That is, our evolution is globally, yes, the evolution of life on Earth is for diversity because the world is constantly changing. And if you are all the same, if your biological species is genetically homogeneous enough, you risk that with the next change in the world, some kind of cataclysm or the appearance of a pandemic, you will all just disappear, go extinct. That's it. That's why evolution is aimed at creating diversity. And the most ancient level is mutations. That is, mutations, it would seem, yes, you could imagine all sorts of DNA copying mechanisms so that mutations almost never occur. Then, for example, the same problem of oncology would be, well, so rare. Well, like maybe one person would have it. Take sharks, for example. Why is it like that for them? Yes, cancer occurs extremely rarely because they have mechanisms that very strictly control mutations. If you stabilize 300 million years ago and your species still exists, but a shark is a super predator that lives in a very stable environment called the ocean. When you live on land, there is no such stability. And what do we see? Evolution apparently deliberately doesn't make DNA copying mechanisms, well, I don't know, 100% reliable. Let there be occasional breakdowns. These breakdowns are the golden reserve from which evolution can later draw good beneficial mutations. But in reality, this process is very extensive because for every successful mutation, when something in your body improves, there will be 10 unsuccessful ones and another 90 neutral ones. But in any case, the creation of new mutations is essentially the original foundation. It's like new words appearing in a dictionary. But what happens next, it turns out? Diversity arises not just from mutation, but also from gene mixing. You combine 2 organisms to produce a mixed offspring. That's how sexual reproduction starts. And in fact, at first organisms are generally hermaphrodites, then the division into males and females occurs, and this exchange of genes is the original purpose. So when we look at such simple levels of evolution, we see that the male tries to fertilize as many females as possible, and the female tries to get sperm from the maximum number of partners, polygamy, and then further towards monogamy. This shifts for various reasons, including the need for long-term reliable care for the offspring and taking care of the young. And this is very characteristic of our evolutionary line, the evolution of warm-blooded animals, birds and mammals, because a warm-blooded offspring cannot survive without a parent. Being warm-blooded is very important. It's an amazing evolutionary breakthrough. As a warm-blooded creature controlling your 36.6 degrees, you can live anywhere, from the tropics to the Barents Sea, though the tropics are preferable. But your offspring can't survive without their parents. Take a fish. It can lay eggs under a rock and the fry will survive on their own. Or, I don't know, reptiles. A turtle lays its eggs and swims away and the hatchlings somehow manage. But with warm-blooded animals, that doesn't work. Offspring need care. Monogamous relationships prove highly advantageous, which is why many biological species adopt them.
Turns out these bloggers advocating polygamy for men are really just promoting an atavism.
Well, you can't really call it an atavism, right? So polygamy is by no means an atavism because it's still very widespread in human society. Half of marriages end mainly due to mutual infidelity, so it's not an atavism yet. Rather, it's about the competition between an older program and a newer program. Well, if we compare it to food, the ancient program is like, eat everything you see. And the new program is more like, well, be a conscious consumer of calories and nutrients in general.
About children. In the animal world, most animals are born quite independent. Spiders already know how to weave webs, bees can already build honeycombs, but humans are born, well, helpless. On their own, they can't do anything, they're very dependent on their parents, and it takes a long time for them to learn how to communicate. They can't speak at first. This brings up a question for me. Is our ability to communicate progress or evolution? In other words, is it a human achievement or an evolutionary achievement? Well, yeah.
Actually, it's both. So look, here's what happens. If we look at different brains, the ones that exist in the world, and freeze them, there are two main points: complex masks. You can get a neural network with pre-installed programs, and then your behavior will be set directly, rigidly. If you're well adapted, like a shark or spider, you keep successfully weaving your web, and that's fine. But in parallel with this, evolution begins to create empty neural networks, those that are born with the ability to learn and record new information. And this is exactly the evolutionary line of vertebrates, birds, and mammals. So our large hemispheres at the moment of birth almost don't contain any data. But just like a computer's hard drive, a disk, there's a lot of empty space where you can record all sorts of different files, from food preferences to your own language. And this approach turned out to be very successful. Again, if we look at the evolution of life, we see two very different options. To create rather short-lived organisms with innate programs, and thanks to their rapid generation turnover, they evolve. And this line, let's say, of insects or some kind of arthropods, and to create long-lived organisms that will be born almost like a blank slate, with an empty brain, at least when it comes to complex skills. And then they will learn and live not for 2 months, but for 20 years, or maybe even 100 years. And this option also turned out to be very successful. That is, evolution doesn't have any specific goal, it tries all the options. The option that is adaptive is the one that remains on the face of the planet. And why is it that some
animal, if it has, let's say, an empty space in its head where we can program something, why can't we teach someone to speak?
Well, actually, truly complex, empty neural networks that are capable of speech and communication, that's actually pretty rare. Our closest evolutionary line is apes, especially great apes. As you know, there are studies where if you raise a chimpanzee baby as your own child, teaching it words and sign language, the language of the deaf, sign language, then the ape learns about 100 words annually, in somewhere around 700 to 800, maybe even 1,000 words. That's the level of a 2.5-year-old child. This is real thinking, and the ape expresses its thoughts, expresses its desires. It can show, I want this banana. Or maybe we haven't seen our usual dog in a while. Where is she and how is her health? There have even been stories described where something, even like jokes, happened. For example, after a caretaker named Jack offended a monkey, she began calling him Dirty Jack. But that's not even a joke, it's more like an insult. That is, she deliberately adds this epithet to his name to show her negative emotions. And that's exactly what's happening to us. Scientists are now studying speech capabilities. This recording is being studied on various canaries and amadines. These are small birds similar to sparrows, but they sing in a complicated way and so on. Yes, in this very small bird brain there are centers similar to our speech centers. They're even genetically similar. There's a gene called FOXP2 which controls the development of these networks and their interaction with the motor area. You can actually see how the song is recorded there, and the young male, the chick who has just fledged, listens to how his father sings in order to remember the song. And then he keeps practicing. This matters because in canaries or nightingales, if you sing poorly, females won't notice you. That's why you need to practice for a few years. During this time, you prove that you can also find food well, escape from predators, and that you have a good immune system. A good song of words, I'm complicated. Yes, it's like a man's credit card before the bank. You can see how many zeros are there. You can immediately tell the quality. It's pretty much the same story with these birds. And because of their evolutionary direction, they develop this way. These are the very empty neural networks where songs are recorded in those same birds that are mimics, like parrots. They don't have their own
mountain song.
Yes, they're all social. So actually this ability to speak is also encouraged by the fact that we live together. And we live together because together we can do more. So this idea of creating a big empty brain and filling it is very important. For a child to grow up in normal conditions with plenty of useful information, they still need both a mom and dad. Maybe not absolute, but still monogamy. At least for a few years, so that, the brain can develop somehow, then the right information gets recorded there. But look, yes, any language can be learned, and not just language. It's also math, physics, economics, medicine. Of course, it's important to train here.
Love endures 3 years. It turns out that maybe because we need monogamy, it only appears during the first 3 years. In general, why?
In my opinion, phrases like that don't get any kind of statistical support.
There's no such thing.
I'm just tired of these questions, so I started looking into it. Specific ones, something is getting in the way, that's exactly what I'm writing to stop the protection, to increase responsibility, and in point A, IT tal. Or like early birds and night owls, so there's a logic behind it. It sometimes works for certain individuals, but on a large scale, the statistics don't support it well. But probably the best analogy is all these Aries, Capricorns, Leos, Virgos. Here too, there's absolutely no statistical evidence. But the thing is, if society tells us that love lasts 3 years, your brain really starts to pay attention after 3 years. Like, well, that's it, right? Can I just, move on? I mean, you might not be, do you, as a Virgo, you might not differ much from your Libra or Leo neighbor. But if you're constantly told that a Virgo behaves like this, like they're boring, reliable, right? Then your neural network kind of gets reformatted to fit that.
Can I ask a question about dopamine? I hope most people generally understand how it works. Examples of both overactive and underactive dopamine systems. So where do maniacs fit in? Well,
maniacs can be different. Which maniacs did you just think of? There are
some that are quite harmless.
Yes.
Let's talk about the harmless ones.
Harmless ones include things like cleanliness mania, constantly cleaning your apartment or washing your hands. Many people during the coronavirus pandemic lost their minds this way. Or maniacs? Weight control. The mania is always connected.
Calorie is recorded.
Records it. Every 50 grams lost is a victory, pure euphoria. So usually it's mania. It's associated with excessive dopamine activity in the center of some biological need. So, in general, there are two aspects of excessive dopamine activity that show themselves so clearly. When there's too much dopamine in the cerebral cortex, it speeds up thinking. Up to a certain point, that's even good. Then your thoughts race so fast you can't collect them and hallucinations start. This is schizophrenia, and antipsychotic medications that block dopamine help control it. Well, partly yes, but still nothing better has been invented yet. If there's too much dopamine in the center of some need, manic disorders can occur. At first it's just increased activity or hypomanic behavior, but then it turns into full mania. We label it as harmful mania when the person starts harming themselves and others.
Is this the reason why so many great scientists are sometimes not very healthy people? Because they have a lot of dopamine.
Somewhere, yes.
Why are there so many? Is that good or bad? What about a person who, for example, is autistic or has some kind of personality disorder, but at the same time is an insanely strong mathematician? Well, for example, there was the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe.
He was truly insane, the original version of that character. Well, I have lectures called Brain and Giftedness. There is some approximate, but still statistics. In fact, when we talk about gifted, very bright, almost genius and genius people, still 80, maybe even 90% of them are quite normal. So there are about 10, 15, at most 20% of people with deviations. Typically, the problem is that this deviation or pathology, such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, or autism, much more often disrupts brain function. But sometimes, honestly speaking, you can get lucky and the pathology starts to work in favor of the person's giftedness. And that's when actually we see these kinds of cases. Well, the classic examples are Van Gogh and Dostoevsky, who were epileptics, or for example, John Nash, who really was. Actually, what is his biography? He's a great mathematician, right? In his early 20s, he did work on game theory that later earned him the Nobel Prize. And apparently, yes, his dopamine system was working very actively, both at the cortical level and somewhere at the level of curiosity programs. It can still be associated this way, but after he did this work on game theory, it clearly started to show. Schizophrenia, by the way, usually manifests itself between the ages of 20 and 30. Yes, it shows up earlier in men and later in women, but that's just general statistics. People usually start taking neuroleptics and suppressing the dopamine system during this period. And that's exactly what's shown in the movie. And in the movie, it's as if everything ends there. But in reality, the story is much more interesting and deeper. There might be a series about it, or maybe one exists, and I just don't know. Because after about 20 years of adapting to neuroleptics, he found such a balance in his brain activity that he was able to powerfully return to mathematical research again. And besides the Nobel Prize in Economics for game theory, he also received the Abel Prize in Mathematics, which is awarded specifically to mathematicians and is considered the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. These are entirely different works, focused on complex differential equations and related topics. So he managed to find, after all, a certain optimal balance, and that's incredibly interesting. That's quite optimistic. It shows that people with brain dysfunctions or disorders can find their place and thrive in society if they are properly integrated, supported, and given the right conditions. Well, in Nash's case, his wife played a huge role, and she herself was an outstanding mathematician. But she basically put aside her own activity and life just to help him return and to make sure he could live comfortably. That's an incredible story, especially since they reportedly died together in a car accident. I highly recommend everyone to get acquainted with this biography.
Professional burnout, they say that you accelerate it or increase its intensity or bring it closer if you don't change your place of residence and don't change your workplace for a long time. Is that true, and does it help or do anything for someone? How should you feel about needing to change your job or where you live occasionally? Is it necessary to do this?
Well, actually, professional burnout was originally described for people in social professions. And it wasn't even about work or place of residence, but about the fact that you interact a lot with clients, or, for example, a teacher, right? With students. A doctor, again, a social worker, like that. Your brain and body use significant resources during this interaction, leaving you exhausted. Professional burnout is essentially a form of chronic stress. So how do you deal with professional burnout? There are many volumes on this, as psychologists have written seriously about it since the 1980s. There's Christina Maslach, a classic in this field, right? And basically, yes, two general pieces of advice, right? So either you change your job while staying in the profession, but you open up some new areas. Maybe at some point, moving away from such intense interaction, I end up focusing on something more theoretical with colleagues or clients. Or let's say you change your field and learn new methods. It's this novelty and switching. It certainly helps to compensate for the effects of burnout. But here's another problem. How much is your brain actually tuned to interact with another person? We have mirror neuron systems which are actually related to empathy. And in the end, when we look at different people again, we see that some enjoy interacting with others, they're more extroverted and all that. But others don't really like it. They're more interested in themselves. They're introverts. So because of your personality type, you might not end up in the job you actually enjoy, the one where you actually function. So in reality, if you're dealing with burnout, you need a psychologist who can look at what you're doing and give you some advice. Changing jobs completely is also stressful. Usually life shows us that within your competencies, there's some additional area where you can expand further. Well, for example, in my case, I'm originally a scientist, a researcher working in a laboratory. Then the area of teaching comes up. After defending your candidate's dissertation and doctorate, you become an associate professor, then a professor, and start lecturing students at the university. And this is really a huge area, which I originally didn't even think about. Well, and in recent years, another area has suddenly opened up. Popular science lectures and writing books. I'm interested in this. My temperament and personality type fit it, and several family members are involved too. Teachers, rural teachers, so this type of communication my brain enjoys. Well, and this kind of expansion, you always have to keep it in mind. Where am I going to grow next? Because in my opinion, there's nothing worse than hitting a certain ceiling of your skills and abilities. In my opinion, modern medicine doesn't really let you do that. New methods are constantly appearing, new approaches, something new is always being invented. And now this breakthrough, again with neural networks and artificial intelligence, is truly global. Life often prevents us from burning out, so it's important to stay open to new things. And what's the problem with burnout? It's not only about your profession, it can apply to personal relationships too. And then you need a family psychologist, a therapist who will say, look, here you're spending too much energy, here there's too much stress, and here it would be good to add some positive emotions.
What is the best motivation for a child to study? Is it the feeling of fear that he'll get a bad grade, that his parents will scold him? Or is it a reward, that he'll be praised, that he'll be the best, that he'll get something bought for him?
Well, the best reward is when I'm interested. And there's also a second layer. I'll be better than others and I'll really get praised. So this competitiveness, basically aggression, is transformed into competitiveness for us. And almost entirely, so it's not right to suppress it when raising children. You're taking away a very important source of inner energy. But the most important thing, of course, is curiosity. And when we raise a child, we show them different areas. And ideally, school should do this with different subjects. Then a teacher comes in with shining eyes and talks about their literature or history or physics. If that's the case, but again, we run into the problem of burnout, because if the teacher is burned out, then what?
Why are children so cruel?
Well, children are different, you know. Sometimes your child meets a kitten on the path and says, that's it, mom, dad, this kitten is going to live with us. And that's exactly the main problem, because you can't just forcefully take the child away, right? But you don't really want the kitten either. That's why sometimes adults also have to be cruel. As a rule, this is associated with the concept of us versus them. Well, honestly, I guess I'm not that much of an expert in child psychology, but still, yes. For example, school conflicts and all sorts of things like that. Attacks, humiliation, yes, things like that against their classmates who dress differently, speak differently, or do something differently. This is usually connected to dividing people into us and them, into certain groups or packs. And all of this is gradually overcome through upbringing and broadening one's horizons, building your experience and learning from us as parents, because a child brings to school the stereotypes that he mostly saw in his family.
All right. Let's say the teacher is basically a boss, not a teacher, but a boss. Which is better, respect for the boss? I think it was in the movie The Godfather. Which is better, to be feared or to be respected?
Well, ideally, you should start with respect. And being feared, well, that's actually... Of course, it wouldn't hurt if it was there somewhere as well. Because security programs are important, and not using them would be strange, of course. In the course of upbringing, that's it. But as someone who operates in a university environment, yes, I always start from respect. And in fact, our university education is largely based on what we tell our students. Doubt everything we tell you, right? That's basically how science works. What you're hearing now is not the ultimate truth. It's not some sacred book carved in stone forever. Look, 100 years ago we thought about it one way, 50 or 10 years ago another way. And now, what will it be like in 20 years? And you, when you enter the classroom, especially when it's not first or second year students, but already master's students, yes, every time you start from scratch and essentially you prove to them that what you're telling them is important, that they'll learn a lot of new things, and that's great. It keeps you on your toes. Because when you already function within an established hierarchy, so to speak, you have your stripes on your shoulders and the right number of stars, and all the questions disappear. Of course, this makes your brain much more rigid and less creative. And as a result, you get that very fragility of the system that in fact was talked about a lot during the pandemic.
It's already working, yes.
Of course. Well, it's just lie detectors, which were invented more than 100 years ago, were mainly based on vegetative responses. Yes, sweating, cardiogram, and also breathing, that's it. Modern lie detectors are a much more complex story, and autonomic indicators of direct stress are no longer significant. First of all, microexpressions are analyzed, and at such a level that our eyes often don't even see all these details. And the change in voice timbre, which...
We don't hear it, but it's there.
Yes, so actually there are many things there. They already go beyond the threshold of our brain sensitivity, but they remain within the sensitivity range of computer processing programs. And again, with the connection of artificial intelligence, these self-adjusting networks. Now actually, experts say that the detection is not just of lies, but of the emotions you experience. And it reaches a reliability level of 95–97%. It's not just about lies, right? So lying is kind of an easy task, but a more subtle set of emotions, let's say 40 basic emotions and also their intensity. And what's interesting is that it works contactlessly. That means you might not even know that you're being detected. But there's a movie camera, there's a microphone, and on the display screen of the person talking to you, there are graphs being shown. So he got nervous, and here he got worried about something. Let's dig a little deeper. Yeah, here he's bored. Well, probably he feels calm in this area. This is very serious.
Why are we afraid of scary movies like thrillers or horror films? Even though we know it's an actor, we know it's a movie, we're sitting in a comfortable theater and it's just a set of images on the screen. Even when we understand, we sometimes feel primal fear or want to look away. Why?
Not everyone, of course. Someone with self-control will ask, what nonsense are we watching? It's clear these monsters are either computer-generated or plush toys, and the blood is just ketchup. That's it. But the talented creator of such a film will still be able to reach, for example, your reflexive responses. Usually horror movies start by showing a cozy situation at first. How do they usually begin? Usually everything is fine, everyone is happy, and you relax in this environment. Bang, bang, suddenly strong sensory stimuli appear. All of this, what is called suspense, yes, is created by all these rustles, creaks, and flashes of light. Next, certain facial expressions have an innate effect on us, yes, like expressions of threat or fear. So, by working through these innate channels, a talented director can still manage to engage our mirror neurons. They also work innately in us and create a certain illusion. But ideally, when you go to a horror movie, you go there ready to be scared. Ideally, that mental block isn't there. So, what did we actually pay for? When we go to the theater, we look at the program and it says comedy, so we go in ready to laugh. If it says tragedy, we go in ready to cry. If you go without that mindset, why are you even going? You're just wasting your money. You'd be better off buying yourself something tasty. That's really the whole point of the play in many ways. Play behavior is a distinct aspect of behavior found in humans and animals. These are innate programs. And play is when, in a priori safe environment, you are still willing to practice certain skills, behaviors, reactions, or experience emotions. And in this sense, sports are the same. It's largely about that. Yes, after all, it's aggression, war, and rivalry, but in a controlled way, unless you, of course, don't actually use a real choking hold or completely break someone's elbow joint on your partner.
Milk in children, breastfeeding. Opinions vary. Some advise against breastfeeding, others recommend it until age 2, and some opt for formula immediately. In the book, it is clearly stated that you need to breastfeed that breast milk contains, for example, casomorphins, and children who are breastfed. They are calmer, quieter, and they learn better. They are more teachable and more successful. So how long should a child be breastfed after all?
Well, ideally we should have a few women with breastfeeding experience sit here and organize a discussion among them. Well, in general, both the World Health Organization and pediatricians say that, well, yes, 6 months is good, 8 is better, 10 months is even better. And this allows many of the child's body systems to transition to mostly independent functioning as comfortably as possible. That is the same intestinal peristalsis and all of these things. Dozens of hormones that keep it functioning. These systems need to mature. The immune system also needs to gradually recognize different antigens and form a sort of standard set of antibodies. It's preferable for the child to have this first year. And the point really is that it turns out there are quite a lot of physiologically significant components in milk, that is, milk proteins. The same caseins, which have always been considered a source of nutrients, that is, building materials and energy. It turned out that inside there are fragments that improve intestinal function, again, the formation of immunity, really reduce a child's anxiety and increase, the attachment to the mother. Yes, this is the desire to be close, to be near the parent, that's it. There are regulatory fragments within these milk proteins, plus, of course, antibodies, because there is actually a group of these very immunoglobulins A, which in the intestine help restrain potentially harmful bacteria. That's why breastfeeding is recommended at least up to a certain point, like 6, 8, 10 months. And after that, it's up to the mother's choice. A lot is determined, just like with food, by traditions. If in your society it's common to breastfeed for 2 years, then that's perfectly normal. There are no particular physiological limits here. When we look at great apes, we see that their young are nursed calmly until the age of 2. Sometimes the next one is already born, but the older one still tries to get his share, so the mother chases him away with a smack on the head. Well, because there are only 2 mammary glands. Well, by the way, yes, the number of mammary glands a female has actually hints at how many offspring she'll have. There is always, as a rule, 1 extra, so if there are 2 mammary glands, then there is 1 offspring, and maybe 2, for example, elephants are the same way, yes, so 2 mammary glands. But if you have 12 nipples, then obviously you're likely to give birth to about 10 offspring. And by the way, a human baby, of course, is born not very developed, but basically monkeys give birth to relatively mature offspring. Because if we take burrowing mammals, like cats, dogs, or even white rats, our laboratory ones, their offspring are born completely blind and deaf. So there, for example, the moment a puppy is born, or a newborn kitten or rat pup is at a similar prenatal development stage as a 6-month-old human fetus. So they actually give birth to what you could call extremely premature babies, but then their physiology is designed so that everything matures further after birth. Our baby is born more or less okay, with eyes already open. If it's born earlier, then there are separate problems. Because when they start raising a deeply premature baby in an incubator, it turns out that you have to take into account a huge number of factors. Yes, to maintain the concentration of various substances at the right level. In particular, for example, it turned out that too much oxygen can harm retinal development. That's a whole separate world. How can we simulate the prenatal development of a premature baby?
What causes maternal depression?
Well, actually, science now considers this both a physiological and medical issue, unfortunately, as a quite likely event related to a sharp spike in hormones. That is, during pregnancy, in order for the placenta to function properly, a very high concentration of progesterone is needed. Prolactin is also quite high, and estrogen levels are also quite elevated. At the moment of childbirth, the placenta leaves, there's no more progesterone, and a kind of hormonal drop occurs. And during this hormonal drop, sometimes maternal behavior doesn't kick in right away or isn't as intense, because for maternal care to start, the hormonal background is very important. We have centers for parental behavior in the anterior hypothalamus. Of course, men have them too. And actually, that's where prolactin and oxytocin act first and foremost. These 2 peptides are the most important here. And progesterone also affects this center. But at the moment of childbirth, there can be a failure, and maternal behavior may not start properly. And here it's important to understand that there is what's called postpartum blues, which is a kind of sadness that occurs right after the baby is born. And you might not feel very comfortable or very happy at first. But this usually goes away within 1 to 2 weeks, and it's largely related to the trauma experienced during childbirth. But real depression, they say, usually appears only in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th week, in the 2nd month, or in the 3rd month. And here actually the problem is that women should, and husbands too, of course, men should realize that this is a fairly likely situation. Up to 15% end up in this situation. And it's important not to hide it and not to think like, I'm not happy about the child, maybe I'm a bad mother, but to work on it. Sometimes psychotherapy is enough. If that's not enough, then antidepressants are needed. Then naturally breastfeeding stops and we switch to formula. But overall statistics show that it's better to feed with formula. But being a joyful and caring mother, rather than breastfeeding while being in a state of depression, is less traumatic for the child and for the development of their nervous system.
Is oxytocin crucial for marital happiness?
Well, not just oxytocin. There are a lot of factors, starting from how your wife cooks for you and ending, of course, with the oxytocin orgasm that happens if our intimate relationship ends successfully. And that's why oxytocin is important. But if we're talking specifically about the hormonal background, there's another molecule here that's similar to oxytocin. It's called vasopressin. It works more with monogamous programs. That's why there are already studies that say, depending on what kind of vasopressin system you have innately, you are more or less prone, for example, to cheating.
So in principle, maybe soon there will be a pill that a wife will go buy at the pharmacy. She'll say, pay.
You love me, drink it you.
Become 100% monogamous? Well,
yeah, I think it would be easier to implant a video camera in certain parts of the male body. That would definitely be more reliable. Pelevin has a story about mutual implantation controlling devices. If something goes wrong, a signal is sent to the lawyer and divorce proceedings begin immediately. Pelevin calls this alien penetration.
If the main thing, so to speak, is not the stimulus, but the goal of life is offspring? Why are there situations when a mother abandons her child? Not everyone can jump out the window because the instinct for self-preservation is very strong. Why does someone jump out and someone else abandon their child, for example? Why? Is this an illness, a pathological condition? How should we view it?
Well, when a certain behavior clearly causes harm to the person themselves or to someone around them, we already consider that a pathology. To abandon a child, does that mean the centers didn't work? Well, I'm simplifying the situation, of course. Yes, the centers of maternal behavior, and that does happen. So once again, these programs related to biological needs are separate informational entities that compete in our brains. Food, curiosity, safety, and also parental care. If this program is weak, parental care. It mostly depends, for example, on hormonal background. Then it may never win throughout life. And then the person says, I'm child-free, and actually I don't need children at all, although maybe I'll get a cat or a dog and that'll be enough for me. That means to sublimate through them. It's worse when this happens after the child is already born. But really, the same postpartum depression can be prolonged and turn into major depression. That is, when it lasts for a year, usually clinicians discuss major depression.
Pheromones exist.
Of course, even humans, human pheromones, but in animals, it's just like totally different. It's the oldest way of communication, to use a chemical substance to tell others about your condition. Pheromones aren't only for reproduction, they also signal safety and mark territory. For example, territorial behavior. Recently, zoologists were talking about coral fish. It turns out that coral fish, just like dogs, mark their territory with scent. But instead of peeing on a coral bush, they rub their sides against it. And the slime they leave behind has an individual scent. Now humans, because of their pack lifestyle, our pheromones started working less effectively because when you're in a pack and there are so many signals, it's hard to figure them all out. But the most interesting story is about our sex pheromones, because this system is clearly suppressed by evolution. Well, basically the logic is roughly as follows. If the system of sex pheromones manifested itself in a clear form, like, I don't know, in dogs and cats, then an ovulating woman, yes, releasing pheromones, would disrupt the sexual behavior of all males. And what kind of monogamy could we even talk about in this case? That's why evolution has transformed things for us, so that ovulation is hidden and very few pheromones are released. And by the way, those who say that polygamous behavior is more ancient and monogamous behavior is more recent, they almost always use hidden ovulation in women as one of their main arguments. That is, the egg that is released is not for all the males in the tribe, but for that one and only male with whom we will raise offspring together. And pheromones aren't needed. They're not needed. I wanted
to ask why everyone has different tastes at a certain point in the book, but then I found the answer to it. You write in the book that the standard of who we want to see as our partner is actually formed during puberty. So, not in childhood, not because of our mother, but specifically during puberty. And who is this person who is nearby? It's our parents.
Well, actually, that's something psychologists work with as well. There are physiological studies where they show various pictures, put someone in a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and show pictures with faces, typical faces of people surrounding the child. Yes, the standard can be the parents, it can be members of your family of the opposite sex. It's not surprising that classical literature contains many stories about cousins. That is, cousins, second cousins sometimes, I don't know, uncles, aunts, and so on. But what's very important is that the focus, for example, on appearance, on distinctive facial features really happens during puberty, in the adolescent period. And here again, it's the story of us versus them. Remember, we talked about school children. It's the same story here. That is, it's very important that the person you are ready to spend your life with resembles some kind of ideal. It's important, but not absolute. But if we look at our history, it's clear that this kind of mindset really helped people identify their own. People used to live in tribes of about 150 to 200 people, 100, 150, 200 at most. And the neighboring tribe, it wasn't always friendly, and sometimes it was even an enemy. And somehow everything revolved around your own people. Now, when people live in big cities where they see very different phenotypes and people of different races and nationalities, all of this is very blurred. Not to mention what movies, television, and social media give us. So, in fact, this kind of phenotypic external adjustment has largely disappeared.
An example in upbringing. I don't have a child yet, but I believe that depending on what you show, the child will take a lot from you. For example, won't you smoke less? Not exactly, but there's less chance that he will smoke. If you do sports, maybe he will like sports more. But there's also the opposite. Like Shusha said, I have friends whose dad drank a lot. And on the contrary, because they saw a bad example and suffered from it, now they don't drink at all. Not even a little, not even a shot. They completely refuse it for themselves. Why does someone take a bad example as a negative example, right? While someone else ignores a good example? Does leading by example actually work or not?
There is a mechanism, it's called mirror neurons. That means we are wired to imitate, including imitating our parents. So that's why Do As Mom and Dad Do is basically a child's core program. And someone recently told me how she hurt her leg and limped around the apartment for a few days, and then the baby, about a year and a half old, started limping too. If mom does it that way, I probably should too. If mom or dad behave badly and it clearly brings negative emotions, then in this case, learning can actually happen in the opposite way. And here, it's not mirror neurons that will work, but rather the avoidance of negative emotions. In other words, it's more like learning through the stick rather than the carrot.
Empathy involves mirror neurons too.
Yes, a lot of work is being done on this now. It's a special group of mirror neurons that transfer other people's emotions to us, and we share in others' joy and feel compassion. Like other innate behaviors, genetics play a major role here. Oxytocin is being studied very actively in this context. And this system, for example, is sometimes impaired in people with autism spectrum disorders.
Sex has simply become a source of joy in the modern world. Or is the main goal still reproduction? Because now people treat it as like a massage, like something that was once used to conceive a child, but now it's just a part of your daily life, a way to get pleasure, a way to maintain your health. I
would still suggest a third option, yes? Sex is a way to strengthen and optimize your relationship with your partner. To say that we are together, I care about you. Your feelings are important to me. Pleasure. Well, yes, but it's not just your personal pleasure, it's your shared pleasure. Because no matter how you look at it, if we choose someone, we say it. Ancient programs are polygamous, new ones are monogamous. And everyone wants to find their soulmate, of course, to hug them and stick together forever. That's it. That's why I would still talk about sex in a higher sense when we do it together and it makes us happy.
The impact of pornography on the brain is especially significant in those who view it excessively, particularly teenagers and those without sexual experience. There's even a separate form. After about 5 years of masturbating to pornography, people may develop erectile dysfunction and find it hard to begin a normal sex life. What is your attitude as a scientist and specifically towards pornography?
Well, actually, there are quite a lot of studies on this topic. Nothing good comes out of it because people really do have sexual behavior programs, including, actually physical intimacy and sex. They don't grow toward greater spirituality or for your development and for you and your partner, but instead become much more egocentric. And actually, instead of this kind of when a human and spiritual connection becomes animalistic and grounded, it basically turns into something else. An analogy from history, I don't know, like with fast food. That is, instead of something conscious and diverse, like good, interesting food, you find something simple and unpretentious. But in the end, it twists your brain so much that you basically lose the creative abilities connected to this area. And sex is amazing creativity, and every physical intimacy I don't compare it to jazz improvisation for nothing. When it all begins, you don't even know what it's going to turn into. That's what sex is. It's not just about getting an erection and releasing those sperm.
That's more like playing a triangle, not jazz. Tell me, does this affect dopamine and its levels if a person abuses pornography? In
principle, dopamine means that to survive.
To survive, 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 to survive.
It seems to me that there's some kind of dopamine overload here. Here it's more about the fact that by using pornography and masturbation instead of real relationships, you end up directing all your behavioral patterns, programs, and habits in that direction. And you kind of deprive yourself of this wonderful world, love, and mutual physical joy. And novelty, maybe in some way. Maybe dopamine is at work here.
The basics of aggression, I read that the three sources of our aggression are the fight for sex, the fight for food, and the fight for territory. But basically, in the modern world, there's not much of that left. We don't fight with anyone unless we're talking about some kind of geopolitical battles. So why do we get angry then? And in general, is it good or bad to be angry?
Well, actually, those negative emotions that arise when something doesn't work out for us are a function of our brain. In other words, a negative emotion, it actually shows our neural networks that you did something wrong and didn't fit into the environment. And then the question is, how are you going to use this energy from negative emotions? A more aggressive, straightforward option is to just push harder. Like, if something isn't working for me, let me just kick this thing a bit harder. Maybe the door will open. And the constructive option is like, maybe I really did something wrong. Maybe I need to analyze my patterns and act differently in this situation. So it's not just about controlling negative aggression, but using it to somehow grow and change. That's what's difficult. That doesn't happen immediately, and I don't think it always works in your 20s or even 30s. Emotions tell us how well we fit into our environment, and negative emotions are just as important a guide as positive ones. You need to be able to feel them, work with them, and identify them. Again, it's easy to say, but what is aggression really connected to? You feel jealous, you act greedy, right? You get offended, maybe someone hurt your hierarchical instincts, right? Envy, something else. Envy, yes, of course.
Tell me, I always thought that everyone has leadership qualities and everyone wants to be first. Looking at many guys, I realize not everyone needs that. You can really see that some guys just don't have the desire to be a winner, to be number one, to be the best. He just wants to go with the flow.
Is this normal or is it some kind of malfunction? Well, apparently it's quite normal. Primatologists say that in chimpanzee groups, only half of the males are somehow inclined to rise and become the alpha leader. And the other half isn't interested in that at all. They just grow, gain weight, and become what you might call solid middlemen. That's it. This is a story about diversity. Apparently, yes, in our societies, we need obedient workers who are more focused on comfort and conserving energy. And daring guys who are ready to pursue novelty and new opportunities. Such passionate people are ready to cross the ocean. There must be something interesting there.
I read about the alpha hen, that there's always some alpha hen in the chicken coop who... There's a pecking order effect, I think that's what it said.
Yes, the pecking order, yes, that's it.
Tell us about it.
Well, there was this Norwegian, Torle Schilderopp. He was actually the first to start studying the hierarchical behavior of animals, and he started with the chickens that lived in his chicken coop. He discovered that, yes, if you throw them, say, a zucchini, they approach it one by one. There's an alpha chicken, a beta chicken, a delta chicken. So even when there's no obvious hierarchy, like in terms of physical strength or certain skills or tasks performed, this division of labor still a certain hierarchy forms. And this is basically connected to the fact that resources are always scarce. Some get greater access to resources while others get less. And at this ancient level, hierarchy is mainly established through aggression, exactly what Ebbe called the pecking order. But then it quickly becomes clear that for the effective functioning of the pack or community, aggression alone is not enough. And this whole "I'm the boss, you're the fool" thing is quite a traumatic story that leads to general chronic stress. And this is where mirror neurons come into play, which tell us that we have common goals, we have shared tasks, we care about each other. And again, this is picked up by evolution, because in this scenario, the community functions more efficiently. And the same development of mirror neurons of empathy is a result of evolution. When you tell this to philosophers and historians, they say that altruism is also innate in us. It's not the result of upbringing. No, many things, even lofty programs, the drive for new things, caring for others, they all still have an innate basis. And that's wonderful, in my opinion. As a neurobiologist, we have such blocks in our brain that tell us this. If you pursue your goal together with your children, friends, colleagues, students, it will be better than if you try to break through alone.
I saw a formula for life expectancy in a book, an actual mathematical formula. If I remember correctly, the formula includes the mass of the brain. In my opinion, the mass of the animal really does matter, and
Body temperature?
also body temperature.
But this formula is empirical. It was derived by zoologists, specifically those who worked with mammals, with warm-blooded animals. And for me as a neurobiologist, now the most important thing in this formula is the large brain mass relative to body mass. So what's the idea there? It turns out that you might end up with a not so great body. But if you have a large brain that efficiently manages different systems, the gastrointestinal tract, the cardiovascular system, breathing, immunity, hormones, then you will live more efficiently and ultimately live longer. This story is actually about different types of mammals. So if you take a human, a deer, and a panther of roughly the same weight, it turns out that we live the longest. At the same time, the body of Homo sapiens is worse than that of hoofed animals or predators. In general, apes are actually a rather primitive group of mammals. And we're not really well made. We get sick with a lot of things. People often mention teeth. In most mammals, teeth grow continuously and a beaver constantly grinds them down. Or like with an elephant, for example, old teeth fall out and new ones grow in. For us, teeth are a major issue, as with many other systems. But at the same time, our brain manages to run this not-so-great system in such a way that we still live long and, in terms of health, quite happily.
Alcohol and the central nervous system are definitely harmful. I'm interested in the chronic consumption of alcohol in small doses, like when people say 50 grams of vodka in the evening or a glass of dry red wine to balance cholesterol. I don't drink. I want an unbiased opinion because I came across a study, I think. Andrew Guberov posted that those who drink a little bit with dinner every day have a slightly higher cortisol level during the rest of the day compared to others. So it turns out that they are in a kind of chronic mild stress with a higher probability than those who don't drink at all. I want your opinion specifically because every point of view has its opposite. There will always be many studies that oppose this opinion.
Alexander, that's exactly the situation in literature. That is, there are studies that say alcohol is absolutely not needed at all. We shouldn't let this molecule enter our bodies or neural networks. And there are studies that say that having a little bit, not every day, is probably more good than bad. When it comes to large doses, of course, everyone says it's bad, but when it's just a little bit. Every time I get the feeling that these studies are sponsored, the ones about the benefits of small doses are either by winemakers or brewers, because these are often studies from France or, for example, Belgium or the Netherlands. That's where they come from. So, in my opinion, chronic use of alcohol every day or even 2 or 3 times a week is not a very good idea. Our brain is quite capable of managing with its own resources. But really small doses of alcohol, literally 10 half an ounce in terms of pure alcohol, They can slightly activate the dopamine system, and this can even eventually reach cortisol. A significant dose, around 41 3/4 ounces of pure alcohol. It can reduce activation and essentially can be used as an emergency anti-stress factor. And sometimes it's even justified. Well, there can be all sorts of life situations, but obviously it's not something for every Friday, right? That's why actually I would treat alcohol with extreme caution. Microdoses mainly just satisfy our taste buds. And if you tried something like that, it's not a sin.
Sergei Shnurov once said, people say alcohol ruins lives, but how many has it saved? You almost shot yourself, but after a drink you can live.
Something like that, yeah. A very large dose, like 100 grams of pure alcohol, can overload our neural networks. It's called a depressant for a reason. There are antidepressants, but alcohol is a depressant. So if you have a serious hangover in the morning, you don't care about yesterday's problems.
Laziness is the engine of progress. As I understood from the book, laziness is a way to optimize our resources, meaning to achieve goals by taking shorter paths. That's why people saying laziness drives progress makes sense. I made that analogy myself. Orientation in the area, yes, you've been somewhere and you remember how to walk away, how to get there. A lazier person often finds the most efficient way to work. So, what do I need to solve problems? We have a marketing department there. I need to find the laziest people, and tell them, you'll go home when you finish your work and he will find the shortest way to solve it.
Well, that's not a bad move. I don't know if your employees will be happy about it or not. But in general, yes, saving energy is obvious. That's the challenge, because you have to get every calorie first. So why waste it? And these programs, they're really very basic. And this is about shortening the path. We see this in the simplest nervous systems, even starting with some worms. And that's right. So yes, there's always a desire to take the familiar path. Yes, you have different ways to solve problems, but you choose the familiar one. That desire always lingers in the background. Or take procrastination, for example, when instead of tackling a long, difficult task, you put it off and choose a short task that you think you can finish in an hour. There are a lot of stories like that. We need to closely monitor our energy-saving programs. Take physical activity, for example. So, you should go to the gym, even if you don't feel like it, right? Let's take a look at the design. A telescope.
We're talking about creationist, but is there a review or
excommunication among the theoretical? They live so long in
the animal world for the lagging animals, those who can't keep up with the herd, no one stops for them. Most often, they die from hunger or cold. Alone, we have such a phenomenon as caring for our parents. And, as I understood, not all animals have this, only the most highly organized ones. And it turns out there is. So I'm trying to appeal to the conscience of those who don't look after their parents, who don't help them. Turns out, this trendy movement encourages followers not to talk to their parents, claiming they're holding you back. Seriously, there is this idea that let's use science to find an answer for how to hurt them. So, if they treat their parents like that, it means they're closer to primates, not
even to primates, since primates form bonds within their group. These parent-child relationships last a lifetime, and caring for elderly monkeys in the group is actually very pronounced. Anthropologists often stress this as a trait of our Homo genus. After all, Homo includes more than just sapiens. There were other species too, like Neanderthals. And so, anthropologists find the bones of some elderly person in a cave and say, look, yes, he was 50 years old, and back then, living to 50 years old was quite something. He had broken bones all over, he had lost all his teeth, but look, this fracture healed, that one too, which means the tribe took care of him, carried him with them. And these programs of empathy and mutual care are, in a way, very deeply embedded in our biology and physiology. Not to mention that our parents always remain a source of wisdom, and their knowledge and understanding of the world is always deeper than our quick, momentary decisions. And And this is actually similar to the procrastination we mentioned, because sometimes in our plans we choose quick short-term solutions. And our parents, who have lived 20, 30 years longer than us, or even 40, yes, they look at it from a higher vantage point, and their wisdom is truly a separate value. Well, not to mention that you can leave your grandchild with the grandparents.
Yeah. I read that not everyone wants to be a leader because they think it's easier to live as an average person, less stress, less pressure. But I found an interesting phrase in the book that, on the contrary, it's actually easier for leaders to live. Because when you become the leader of the pack, the example for others, you start getting a rush of oxytocin, and it makes your life much easier. You feel really happy, and everything becomes a lot simpler for you. So, being a leader is sometimes much easier than it seems to those who are below.
Yes, but only if you lead a happy pack.
That's when you'll be flooded with oxytocin. But if the pack is unhappy, then oh boy, things can get bad. They might even eat you. Well,
Yeah.
a component of success. I'm drawing my own conclusions, so let me know if I misunderstood. A lot right now. Infogypsy isn't a nice term because of gypsy, but you know what I mean.
I mean, sellers.
Of thin air who promised that they're about to give him a universal key. Pay 900 rubles for the course, and I'll teach you how to become a millionaire tomorrow. In your opinion, is a person's success and overall achievement as an individual made up of experience? That's exactly what they're trying to convey. There are two key components. One is hormonal background. Without it, you won't act if you lack motivation. The third component isn't temperament, but genetics, basically how you were born. What do you think, how much does a person's ability to achieve something depend on having a healthy hormonal and endocrine system? Because I spend a lot of time explaining to people that you should try to keep all your hormones in balance. Try to eat properly, because your productivity largely depends on having a healthy endocrine system. Do you agree with that? Is it impossible to achieve success just through experience and genetics if your hormones are in terrible shape? And how important is that overall?
Well, the endocrine system is the second most important regulatory system in our body. So the brain is kind of about quick reactions, while hormones are more about changes in state that are often quite slow, at least compared to the brain. And this whole team consists of hundreds of social hormones. It creates the right background for our nervous system to function. Starting with thyroxines, which basically determine the functioning of every nerve cell, and ending with some hormones that have more specific functions. Well, today we mentioned oxytocin, leptin, and sex hormones as well. That's why the endocrine system is incredibly important, and monitoring it is essential, isn't it? But at the same time, it's important to understand that your brain's condition and your hormonal state matter. It's a closed system, plus a third component, the immune system. So now, when we seriously talk about the different functions of our body, we're talking about neuroimmune endocrine interaction. And these systems, by influencing each other, ultimately create our optimal performance. In the end, I guess it's happiness, or at least a balance of positive and negative emotions.
The brain and human intelligence are interconnected. Yes.
No direct correlations. Because in reality, the computational resources of our brain are related to how many connections per unit volume our nerve cells form. The connections, called synapses, are important. How many synapses are there per cubic millimeter? So information is processed not by mass and not even by neurons, but by these synapses. And the brain can be quite small in size, but at the same time there are a lot of connections per unit of volume, making it very powerful.
The best way is to train the brain, especially for the elderly. I know that it's beneficial for neurodegenerative diseases, like memorizing poems, knitting, embroidering, learning a new language, or playing a new musical instrument. But if we're talking about a young person, let's say he's in college now or just graduated, and he realizes that maybe he doesn't have as much time for self-development as before, and he's kind of getting dumber, right? So he's become a bit slow-witted, his memory has gotten worse. How can he improve his memory and cognitive function? Could you recommend any practices, techniques, or supplements?
Well, actually, it would be good to take a step back and look at your life from above to see where your energy and time are going. Because this feeling of getting a bit dull and all that is often connected to us spending too much time on social media. Yeah, we spend too much time, way too much time on, I don't know, watching television shows. Sometimes you live too far away, and when you have a 2-hour commute one way, that's a problem too. So sometimes a person just needs to move to another part of the city closer to work, and a lot of things start to get better. That's why you need to look at where your energy is going and where you're not getting enough positive emotions. As a rule, not getting enough positive emotions is usually unacceptable. It's either a lack of novelty, meaning you're slowly moving toward burnout. And you need to think about how to bring new projects into your life, some new, solutions or areas, and your social interactions with your loved ones, close ones, with your children. Isn't it time to have children? Because it's a huge, huge source of positive emotions. That's why we analyze and evaluate. As for nutrition and supplements, the situation is complicated, but again, mindfulness helps us because the modern food industry leaves out a lot of things. And if, after specialists analyze your body using dozens of measurements, not on your own, realize that you need to add a few antioxidants here and maybe support your dopamine or acetylcholine system there. Here you're lacking, let's say, a bit of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and there you don't have enough tryptophan. So all of this will clearly benefit you. But here, well, now we're entering the area of what's called biohacking. That is, you do dozens of tests quite regularly in order to understand your body. It's worth it, since you only have one body to live with for life. That's why you need to get to know it, make agreements with it, and help it.
Can you recommend any books that the kids could read? And they would get it even if, let's say, they don't have a specialized medical education? Practical knowledge that would help them understand their nervous system and brain, so to speak, and maybe find something new and get answers to their questions. I've already posted yours there today and recommended it.
Yes, thank you. As a physiologist, I'll recommend physiology books, not psychology ones. Well, first of all, there was a remarkable English neurologist, Oliver Sacks. You can pick up and read any of his books. They're mostly stories, short essays. How a person had a problem, something went wrong in their body, and then how they dealt with that problem, either recovered or learned to use that problem to their advantage. For example, there's a story about an artist who lost his ability to see colors. And then it turned out that he was excellent at drawing engravings, and he sort of switched to seeing the world in black and white. Here's Oliver Sacks next. Eric Kandel is a kind of guru in the world of neurophysiology. He has wonderful books about memory, about various types of disorders like autism and schizophrenia. It's called The Disordered Mind, that book. And he has a wonderful, very insightful book about how the brain perceives art, Eric Kandel. And my favorite one probably, yes, I'll say it's hard to choose. Viliano Ramachandran is an American neurologist and neurosurgeon of Indian origin. He also writes very interestingly about the brain, including about mirror neurons. And he does it from a clinical point of view. For example, how can you help with recovery after a stroke? And he came up with, for example, these mirror box techniques that help restore hand motor skills.
Could you give some kind of recommendation or advice? For my viewers, most of them are men, about 90%, with an average age of 30 to 35 years old, though there are some older and some younger. This is mostly a reading audience, intellectually developed, so I think you are a great authority for many of them, and your words will mean a lot.
The most important thing is to strive for novelty and to discover new areas of activity for yourself. Professional activity and activities in which you interact with other people. This really applies to your business, your studies, and your personal relationships. This rapid increase in new events is important. And it's important that in this flow, you not only perceive information, but use it in such a way that your neural networks work not only for input, but also for output. And when we look at our brain, we see that the most important part of our personality is what Stephen Hawking called the informational speech model of the world. Today we've talked a lot about needs, and that's kind of the deep unconscious foundation. And the second part, the most important part of the personality, is this very informational speech model. This is essentially the quintessence of all our memory when we use words to describe the world around us. And that's located roughly here in the parietal temporal occipital area. It's from here that we can control both our emotions and our behavior. And when we talk about mindfulness and the ability to manage our nutrition, physical activity, or for example, the degree of our faithfulness, unfaithfulness, all these things, they are actually subject to control from this structure. And there, it's not just our perception of the world, but also our perception of ourselves. And if you think of yourself as creative, proactive, that you can do it, that you'll break through and all that, then your brain really becomes more optimistic, more freedom-loving, and focused on overcoming obstacles. So when people ask, who's more important, me or my brain? To me, that's a made-up problem, since we are our brain and ultimately one with it. And when we think about ourselves and our resources, we're actually making use of this incredibly complex computational system, but the big brain is larger than ourself, because it contains emotions, needs, our memories, sometimes even memories from childhood. So you need to learn how to manage all of this. And for that, you need to watch yourself, be mindful, learn new things, understand that you always need to improve, keep growing, and that there is always a horizon worth stepping beyond. And this will also give you a bunch of positive emotions. The same dopamine and oxytocin, which, by the way, strengthens our immune system.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that you came today and answered all these questions. And I hope this isn't our last meeting. It's not the first, it's already our third meeting, but on my channel it's the first one. And I hope it's not the last.
Thank you very much. I found it very interesting, thank you.